"Get out and stay out," my dad yelled. They threw me out for dropping out of law school. They didn't know I was worth $65 million. Next day, I moved to my Malibu mansion. 3 weeks later, my father, Stephen, was a senior partner at one of the oldest, most prestigious law firms in Connecticut. He believed in 3 things: tradition, the firm, and men. In his world, women were decorative, emotional creatures meant to host charity galas like my mother, Karen. Sons were heirs, daughters were liabilities until they married well. Growing up in that house was like living in a museum where you were not allowed to touch the exhibits. Everything was mahogany, leather, and expectations. My brother Christopher, 2 years older, was the golden child. He was groomed from birth to take over. He got the tutors, the internships, the praise. I got the side-eye. When I expressed interest in law during high school, Stephen laughed. "It's a brutal world, Lauren. You don't have the temperament." So, I stopped asking. I stopped talking. I became the ghost in the hallway. When they sent me to law school merely to find a husband, they assumed I went. But I didn't study law. I studied the inefficiencies of the real estate market. I saw how archaic it was, how valuations were based on gut feelings and old boys club handshakes. In my dorm room, while my classmates were briefing cases on property law, I was coding. I built a state eye, an AI-driven valuation tool that used satellite imagery and predictive algorithms to appraise commercial real estate instantly. It wasn't just accurate, it was revolutionary. By my second year, I had licensed the software to 3 major hedge funds. By my third year, I had sold a minority stake for 8 figures, all anonymous, all hidden behind shell companies. Now, the Uber pulled up to the gates of my new reality. Carbon Beach, Billionaire's Beach. The contrast was visceral. Connecticut was dark wood, heavy drapes, and the smell of old paper. This was glass, steel, and the blinding white of the Pacific sun. The gate slid open. My new home was a $42 million compound. It was sleek, modern, and utterly transparent. I walked through the front door into a living room that seemed to float above the ocean. I set my suitcase down on the polished concrete floor. The sound echoed, sharp and lonely. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed my hand against the glass. This was it. The summit. I had won. I had escaped the suffocating weight of my father's expectations and built a kingdom of my own. I looked around. The furniture was minimal, Italian, and expensive. The kitchen was a chef's dream that would likely never see a home-cooked meal. And then the quiet hit me. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the jet. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness. You think that money buys happiness? You think that the moment the wire transfer hits, the hole in your chest closes up. It doesn't. It just changes the texture of the emptiness. I walked through the empty rooms. My footsteps too loud. 5 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a screening room, a wine cellar, all for one person. I sat on the edge of the massive white sofa and looked out at the ocean. The waves crashed with a rhythmic, indifferent power. My father had thrown me out. He had rejected me, not because I had failed, but because I hadn't failed in the way he expected. And here I was, surrounded by proof of my brilliance, proof of my worth, and I felt cold. The truth is, buying a castle doesn't heal the wound of being exiled from your village. It just gives you a nicer place to bleed. I pulled out my phone. No missed calls, no text from my mother asking if I was safe, no message from Christopher. They had cut me off with surgical precision. To them, I was gone. Good, I whispered to the empty room. Let them think I'm dead, because the Lauren they knew, the quiet, disappointing daughter, was dead. The woman sitting in this glass fortress was someone else entirely. She was the architect, and she was just getting started. 6 months passed. I didn't just survive in Malibu. I thrived. Or at least my bank account did. I ran my empire from a home office that looked out over the water estate. I had evolved into a full-scale prop-tech conglomerate. I was acquiring competitors, disrupting markets, and making grown men in boardrooms nervous. All while wearing yoga pants and drinking green juice. I was the invisible hand moving pieces on a chessboard they didn't even know existed. But I never took my eyes off Connecticut. My AI didn't just track commercial properties. It monitored distress signals. And one morning, a red flag popped up on my dashboard that made me freeze. It was a financial anomaly report on a specific asset, the Henderson estate, my childhood home. I clicked through the data. The mortgage payments were erratic. But that wasn't the big story. The big story was the leverage. My father's law firm, the bastion of stability and prestige, was using the family estate as collateral for a high-risk operating line of credit. The firm was bleeding cash. The old money facade was just that. A facade. They were drowning, and they were using the house to stay afloat. I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile touching my lips. Stephen was risking the roof over his head to keep up the appearance of power. It was poetic. Then my phone buzzed. A name I hadn't seen in half a year flashed on the screen. Christopher. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Hello, Christopher. Lauren. His voice was tight, breathless. Thank God you picked up. I didn't know if this number still worked. It works. What do you want? I know things were bad when you left. Dad was well, you know, Dad. But I need a favor. A big one. I'm listening. I'm in a jam low. Temporary cash flow issue. Gambling debts. Bad luck. Really? I need $50,000 just for a month. I swear I'll pay you back double. I almost laughed. Gambling debts. That was the classic Christopher excuse. But my algorithms told a different story. The gambling debts were likely cover for embezzlement. He was stealing from client escrow accounts to pay off his own lifestyle, and he needed cash to plug the holes before the quarterly audit. $50,000 is a lot of money for a dropout. Christopher, I said, my voice flat. I know, but I remember you. You always had some savings from your little computer projects. Please, Lo, if I don't fix this, Dad will kill me. He had no idea. He thought I was scraping by on freelance scraps. He didn't know he was asking a shark for a drop of blood. I can help you, I said. I could hear him exhale. A sound of pathetic relief. You can? Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you. On one condition. Anything. You sign a promissory note. Securing the loan against your future inheritance. Specifically, your interest in the estate. What? Why do you need that? Because I'm not the little sister who cleans up your messes for free anymore. This is business. Sign the note, or find the money elsewhere. Silence. I could hear the gears grinding in his head. He was desperate. He figured the estate was worth millions. 50 grand was a drop in the bucket. He figured he'd pay me back before it ever mattered. Fine. He snapped. Send the paperwork. I hung up and typed a message to my broker. Execute protocol, Trojan horse. I didn't. Just wire him the $50,000. I used the promissory note as leverage to initiate a secondary transaction. Through my shell company, Nemesis Holdings, I approached the bank that held the struggling mortgage on my parents' estate. They were nervous about the missed payments and the firm's instability. They were happy to offload the risk. I bought the mortgage note. I bought the debt. I didn't just lend my brother money. I bought the deed to the house they were sleeping in. I walked out onto the balcony, the salt air filling my lungs. They were living on borrowed time, and they were living in my house. The invitation arrived via email forwarded by a confused former classmate who assumed I had been left off the list by mistake. It was a digital flyer for the Henderson Firm Jubilee, a gala celebrating 30 years of legal excellence. It was held at the estate in Connecticut. The audacity was breathtaking. They were celebrating a legacy that was actively crumbling in a house they no longer truly owned, paid for by a mortgage they had defaulted on months ago. I decided to please reply. I didn't take the train this time. I flew private to Teterboro, then took a helicopter to a landing pad a few miles from the estate. I rented a sleek black town car and drove myself to the gates. The house looked exactly the same, imposing, cold, a monument to a bygone era of exclusionary power. The driveway was lined with Bentleys and Mercedes, the chrome gleaming under the tasteful landscape lighting. I pulled up, wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than Christopher's car, a suit that wasn't designed to be pretty, but to be formidable. I handed the keys to the valet and walked up the steps where my suitcase had once tumbled. The foyer was crowded with the legal elite of New England judges, politicians, partners. The air smelled of expensive cologne and old money. They swirled wine and murmured about cases, completely unaware that the floorboards beneath their Italian loafers were leveraged to the hilt. My mother, Karen, was the first to spot me. She looked frail, her smile brittle and anxious. A woman who had spent 30 years smoothing over cracks she pretended not to see. She froze, a tray of hors d'oeuvres trembling in her hand. "Lauren," she whispered, her eyes darting around as if I were a stain on the carpet. "What are you doing here?" "I heard there was a party," I said smoothly, picking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "I wouldn't want to miss the celebration. Your father, he won't be pleased. He thinks you're still struggling. Let him think what he wants." I moved past her, cutting through the crowd like a shark through a school of minnows. The ballroom was suffocatingly warm. At the front, Stephen stood on a raised platform, holding a glass of scotch. He looked flushed, arrogant, the king of his little castle. Christopher stood beside him, looking sweaty and nervous in a suit that didn't quite fit right, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Stephen tapped a spoon against his glass. The room hushed. "Friends, colleagues," his voice boomed, slurring just slightly at the edges. "Tonight is about legacy. It is about the foundations we build that outlast us." He put a heavy hand on Christopher's shoulder. The grip looked more like a shackle than an embrace. "I look at my son and I see the future. The law is a harsh mistress. It is not for the faint of heart. It requires strength. It requires fortitude. It requires men of character." A ripple of polite applause went through the room. I felt the specific weight of that word, men. It wasn't accidental. It was the thesis statement of his entire life. To him, competence was a male trait. "My son has that character," Stephen continued, his voice dripping with unearned pride. "He has the steel to make the hard decisions. Unlike those who crumble under pressure, those who lack the discipline for the real world, those who chase little computer games and fantasies." He looked directly at me then. A sneer curled his lip. He didn't say my name, but the room followed his gaze. I felt the collective judgment of 100 people turn toward me. The disappointment, the dropout, the girl who couldn't hack it. In his mind, my failure was the natural order of things. A daughter's role was to fail so the sun could shine. It validated his entire worldview. To Christopher, Stephen toasted, raising his glass high, taking the reins. To Christopher, the room echoed. Christopher caught my eye. He didn't look ashamed. He smirked. He raised his wrist to check the time, a gesture meant to show off the heavy gold watch glinting under the chandelier. I recognized the watch. It was a vintage Rolex. It was the watch he had bought with the $50,000 I had wired him. He was wearing my money on his wrist while his father mocked me for earning it. He was celebrating his ascension using the lifeline I had thrown him. The cruelty was so specific, so casual. It wasn't just that they didn't respect me. It was that they erased me. My success didn't exist in their world because it didn't fit their narrative. To acknowledge my power would be to destroy their own. I took a sip of champagne. It tasted like vinegar. I watched them bask in the applause. Two men standing on a trapdoor, convinced they were standing on a mountain. "Enjoy your toast, Stephen. Enjoy your speech because the ground beneath your feet is already gone. You just haven't looked down yet." The applause died down, dissolving into the self-congratulatory murmurs of men who believed they owned the world. I slipped away from the ballroom, moving like a shadow through the corridors I knew by heart. The house smelled of expensive candles and decay. I needed one final piece of evidence. The mortgage note was the gun, but I needed the bullet. I went up the back stairs to the second floor to Christopher's old room, which he still used as a home office when he stayed over to consult with Stephen. The door was unlocked. Careless, arrogant. Stepped inside. The room was a shrine to unearned achievement. Participation trophies from prep school lacrosse, framed degrees he had barely scraped through. On the desk sat his laptop, open and humming. I sat down, password protected of course. But Christopher was intellectually lazy. I tried his birthday. Incorrect. I tried password 123. Incorrect. I tried the name of his favorite football team. Access granted. I plugged in a USB drive loaded with my own forensic accounting software. It bypassed his clumsy file structures and went straight for the financial data. The screen scrolled with numbers, a waterfall of red ink and illicit transfers. It was worse than I thought. Christopher wasn't just borrowing to cover gambling debts. He was running a Ponzi scheme within the firm. He was taking money from new client retainers to pay off the settlements for cases he had neglected or botched. I saw wire transfers to offshore accounts that looked suspiciously like hush money. I saw forged signatures. Stevenunk's signature authorizing withdrawals from escrow. And then I found the email thread. It was between Christopher and Stephen, dated 3 months ago. Subject: the audit. Stephen: I fixed the accounts for the Jones file. Do not let this happen again. If the bar finds out, we are both finished. I leveraged the house to cover the shortfall. This is the last time, Christopher. I froze. The glow of the screen illuminated the truth I hadn't wanted to see. My father knew. Stephen wasn't just a blind, arrogant patriarch. He was an accomplice. He knew his son was a criminal. He knew Christopher was incompetent, dangerous, and rotting the firm from the inside out. And yet downstairs, he was raising a glass to him. He was calling him a man of character. He was protecting the son who was destroying his legacy, while exiling the daughter who could have saved it. I leaned back in the chair, the answer settling over me like a cold fog. It wasn't logic. It was the architecture of control. Stephen didn't love Christopher because Christopher was capable. He loved him because Christopher was dependent. Christopher needed Stephen to survive. Christopher's failures allowed Stephen to play the savior, the kingmaker, the indispensable patriarch. Every time he bailed Christopher out, it reinforced his own power. But me, I was the glitch in his matrix. I had succeeded without him. I had built an empire he didn't understand using tools he despised in a world where his name meant nothing. My success didn't make him proud. It inflicted a narcissistic injury. It proved that his protection was unnecessary, that his worldview was obsolete. He would rather burn his empire to the ground than let a woman, his daughter, prove him wrong. He would rather shelter a criminal who knelt than embrace a queen who stood tall. It was cognitive dissonance weaponized. He hated me, not because I was a failure, but because I was the only one who wasn't. I pulled the USB drive. I had everything. The fraud, the cover-up, the leverage. I walked back downstairs. The party was winding down. Guests were calling for their coats, cheeks flushed with wine and self-importance. I stood at the back of the room, hidden by the shadows of the heavy drapes. I watched them. The fraudster son, laughing too loud at a joke he didn't understand. The enabler father looking at him with a mixture of pride and desperate denial. They looked so small. 2 men standing in a house of cards, waiting for a breeze. I checked my watch. The banks opened in 9 hours. Tomorrow the verdict would be delivered, and I would be the judge. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of the library, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. I sat in Stevenunk's high-backed leather chair at the head of the massive conference table. I had been waiting there since dawn. At 8 in the morning, the door opened. Stephen walked in, wearing his silk robe, a mug of coffee in his hand. He stopped dead when he saw me. "Lauren?" He blinked, confused. The bravado of the night before stripped away by the harsh morning light. "What the hell are you doing in my chair?" "Sit down, Stephen," I said. My voice was calm, almost bored. "Excuse me. You get out of my house this instant before I call the police." Christopher stumbled in behind him, looking hungover and disheveled. The tailored suit replaced by sweatpants. "What's going on? Who let her in?" "I let myself in," I said. "I have a key." "I took your key," Stephen snapped. "I changed the locks an hour ago," I replied. "Sit down." Something in my tone, a cold metallic authority they had never heard before, made them pause. Stephen sat slowly, his face wreathing. Christopher slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. "I'm going to make this simple," I said. I pressed a button on the remote in my hand. A projector I had set up on the sideboard hummed to life, casting a bright image onto the wall above the fireplace. It was a bank statement, the firm's escrow account, showing the unauthorized withdrawals. "What is this?" Christopher whispered, his face draining of color. "This is felony embezzlement, Christopher," I said. "Forged signatures, client funds used for..." "What was it?" "Online poker. And a lease on a Porsche." Stephen stood up, slamming his hand on the table. "Where did you get this?" "You hacked my files. This is illegal." "Sit down," I repeated. I clicked the remote. The image changed. The email thread. The one where Stephen admitted to covering it up. The one where he admitted leveraging the house. Stephen sank back into his chair. He looked suddenly old, deflated. "You knew," I said, looking him in the eye. "You knew he was a criminal, and you toasted him. You called him a man of character." "He's my son," Stephen croaked. "I had to protect the name." "And me?" I asked. "I was your daughter." "What did you do for me?" "You threw my suitcase down the stairs. You walked away," he stammered. "I didn't quit," I said. Pivoted. I clicked the remote one last time. The image on the wall was a document. A notice of foreclosure. Lender Nemesis Holdings LLC, Nemesis Holdings. Stephen read, squinting. "They own the mortgage note. They've been pressuring us." "Yes," I said. "They have." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. "I am Nemesis Holdings, Stephen." The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. "What?" Christopher breathed. "I bought the note," I said. 6 months ago. I own this debt. I own this house. I own the roof over your heads." "That's impossible," Stephen whispered. You're a dropout. You have nothing." "I have a net worth of $65 million, I said. "I didn't drop out of law school because I couldn't hack it, Stephen. I dropped out because I realized I could buy the law school." I slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is an eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The firm is insolvent. I've already sent the evidence of embezzlement to the state bar. Christopher will be disbarred. You will likely face sanctions." "You can't do this." Stephen gasped. "We Runk family." "Family." I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. Family supports each other. Family doesn't call their daughter a disgrace. Family doesn't cover up crimes to protect a fragile ego. I stood up. I looked down at them, the patriarch and the golden child, both reduced to tenants in a house they couldn't afford. "The verdict is in," I said. "You're evicted." The aftermath was quiet. There were no more screaming matches, no more speeches about legacy or character. Just the shuffling of boxes and the dry scratching of pens on settlement papers. Christopher was disbarred within a month. He avoided jail time only by pleading guilty and turning evidence on a co-conspirator he'd roped into the scheme to hide the money trail. The last I heard, he was living in a studio apartment in New Haven, working shifts at a car rental agency near the airport. The golden boy, who was too good to read his own contracts, was now checking mileage on sedans for $12 an hour. Stephen and Karen moved into a small 2-bedroom condo in a retirement community in Florida. It was a humiliating downsizing, financed by the liquidation of Stephen Unk's remaining assets to pay off the firm's debts. The Connecticut estate was sold. I didn't keep it. I didn't want it. It smelled of stagnation and old lies. I sold it to a developer who planned to gut the mahogany library and turn the property into a boutique hotel. I returned to Malibu. I stood on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the Pacific in shades of violet and gold. The air was cool and clean, stripping away the musty scent of the East Coast. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would feel a surge of visceral joy at having crushed the people who tried to erase me. But I didn't. I felt relief. A heavy, profound relief, like setting down a backpack filled with stones that I had been carrying for 26 years. The weight of their expectations, their judgment, their conditional love, it was simply gone. The anger was gone. 2. You can't be angry at people who are no longer relevant to your existence. The verdict was final, and the case was closed. I pulled out my phone. I scrolled to Christopher's contact. Delete. Then Stephen Unk's. Delete. Then my mother's. Delete. I wasn't an exile anymore. I was a sovereign, but sovereignty can be lonely. I walked back inside and opened my laptop. The house was still vast, still made of glass and echoes, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of isolation, it was the silence of a blank canvas. I had a new project. I opened a fresh document and drafted the charter for the Horizon Scholarship, a $50 million fund dedicated to women in prop tech, specifically women who had taken non-traditional paths, dropouts, outliers, the ones who had been told they were too emotional, too ambitious, or too difficult for the traditional boardroom. I wanted to build a castle that had room for them. I wanted to be the safety net I never had. I looked around my glass house. It was still big. It was still quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt waiting. I had survived the fire. I had built the empire,